Today, we're going to be taking a trip down memory lane to look at some of the most iconic artworks in the Pokémon TCG by none other than Ryo Ueda. We're going to take a look at iconic artworks illustrated by Ueda within 18 sets ranging from the year 2003 to 2022, starting with EX Sandstorm. Although Ueda began illustrating cards in the prior set, Ruby and Sapphire, it's in EX Sandstorm that their unique 3D graphic style really begins to shine. The cards I've highlighted here are the Raichu EX, Wailord EX, and Kabutops EX. The Cosmos Holo effect has always been popular in the Pokémon TCG. However, if you are like me and grew up collecting Pokémon cards in the early to mid 2000s, there was no better feeling than pulling one of these awesome looking EX cards. Ueda had a way of giving each Pokémon their different personalities, even with simple 3D graphic style, which looking back at it has a nostalgic feel that can't be replicated by today's artworks. What makes Ueda an iconic artist though, is the way they adapted with the TCG as different card formats were introduced, which we'll move on to later in the video. In general, I can't really split the E-Series EX cards and the regular EX cards. On one hand, I love the E-Series logo at the bottom. However, the later cards, having the same border thickness all the way round, makes the general design of this card a bit more balanced. In terms of the artworks on these cards specifically, I love the composition and ratio between image and background on the Milotic. This has got to be one of the most gorgeous Milotic cards in the TCG, maybe only rivaled by the new SIR in Surging Sparks. The Venusaur and Raikou both possess a trait that I really enjoy in Ueda's cards. And that is where the Pokémon seems to be bursting out of the card, which is something I will touch on later in the video when we get to the Platinum era. Another version of Ueda's cards in the EX era were his illustrations for some of the most iconic Delta Species cards ever printed. The Mewtwo, Rayquaza, and I've thrown in this beautiful Latias EX. The eminent glow on Mewtwo and Rayquaza is befitting of their dual typing, and the Latias, which is one of my favourite cards, looks like it's travelling at warp speed through some kind of psychedelic wormhole. Some of my favourite cards of any generation, with the Delta Species stamp making them even more unique. Next up is the Diamond and Pearl era, and I've chosen to highlight a couple of really cool trainer cards illustrated by Ueda, that being the Switch and Warp Point. These cards are hugely nostalgic to me, and enigmatic of the 3D graphics I grew up with in the early 2000s. The artworks kind of remind me of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! On the PlayStation 2. Particularly the Warp Point, which features Munchlax and Bonsly, two Pokémon that rarely get a look in the Pokémon TCG. From a collector's standpoint, I would love to see a Munchlax illustration rare. Next up we have the Platinum era of Pokémon cards, and the introduction of Level X Pokémon cards. In these instances, with the Salamence and Arceus, instead of just threatening to break out of the confines of their rectangular artwork box like the Venusaur and Raikou we just talked about, these Pokémon's heads are poking out beyond the frame and making the card design even more dynamic than its counterparts. There is also a crispness and more defined quality to the graphics on these cards. Maybe this is the natural progression of 3D software programs, or it could just be that these images are larger, but in general, these cards to me are the gold standard of this era. Even though I stopped collecting around the beginning of the Diamond and Pearl era as a kid, I love what Ueda did with these artworks, and I'm definitely keeping my eye out for near mint copies of this card if they come onto the market. Now moving on to the Heart Gold, Soul Silver, and Call of Legends era. Being a throwback to Gen 2, the Pokémon company took a step back with these cards, and the result is they have a more vintage feeling than the previous two generations of cards. I personally love the art direction they went with, and I'm planning on creating a whole video talking about this generation in the near future. These artworks on the regular holo rares in Call of Legends are absolutely phenomenal, and in my opinion are severely undervalued. Which is great because I would love to be able to pick up as many of these as possible while they fly under the radar. Iconic artist, iconic Pokémon, and beautiful card designs. I just love these cards, and Ueda is a big part of why they look so good. The composition of each art leaves a good amount of background space for the holographic foil to really make the artworks pop, while also having a clear depiction of these iconic legendaries in action poses. A testament to the range of this artist are these two stadium cards from Heart Gold and Soul Silver era. The Indigo Plateau and Burn Tower were immortalized in the Gold, Silver and Crystal games, and through these cards, Ueda has given me the ability to be transported to these moments I played through as a kid. There are also holographic Japanese LP promotional printed versions of these cards, which were awarded as part of a number of events held during the month of July 2010. But before you get any ideas, these beauties are very expensive due to their rarity. I would absolutely love to own one in the future, and if I had to pick one, I would probably go with the Indigo Plateau on account of the Celebi. That brings us into the black and white era, and this trio of cards showcases how this style of artwork from Ueda can truly cross any generation. In an era where, in my opinion, Pokémon took a bit of a step back, while they were figuring out what they were going to do with card rarities, etc., these artworks still go harder than they have any right to. Full arts were introduced in this era, with Ueda illustrating a couple of the early ones, but where these cards really come into their own was with the introduction of Pokémon X and Y. This is where things really clicked for Ueda's illustrations for full art Pokémon cards, and none were more iconic in this set than the Blastoise EX and Venusaur EX. True chase cards, and everything you would want to see from a full art Pokémon. I love the way the artworks cross the border of the card and are cropped right at the edge. What we saw with these cards was a sign of things to come in X and Y Phantom Forces, as we were treated to one of the true chase cards of the era by Ueda, the Gengar EX. If the Delta species Latias was tripping, this guy is on a different planet. With this card, it feels like everything that is iconic about Ueda's art style comes to a head. Again, it's the perspective here, and the sense of depth that differentiates this card from other full art cards. This is by far one of the busiest backgrounds in terms of colour and form, which is something that I'm not usually a big fan of. But in this particular artwork, the busyness of the background is offset by the block colour and simplicity of the shading on Gengar's bulbous form, as he thrusts himself through the Technicolor vortex. We also have some other iconic artworks from Ueda in this era, like the Rayquaza from Roaring Skies, and the Tyranitar and Giratina from Ancient Origins. Since the XY era, Ryo Ueda has had a more pared back role in the TCG, which has mainly included illustrations for trainer cards. I've picked a few cards from modern sets here that give me that nostalgic feeling of his artworks from early to mid 2000s. These super effective glasses have a nice 3D rendering style, but sit on top of a grid-like background, perhaps an omen of the changing times, and the end of a graphic style that will always hold a special place in my heart.